Wastelands, the true story of farm country on trial. Let's give Corbin a warm welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming out.
No, it's my pleasure.
And I also want to say, on the front of this, it says a foreword by John Grisham. And I just want to read what John Grisham says on the back of this. Beautifully written, impeccably researched, and told with an air of suspense that few writers can handle. Wastelands is a story I wish I had written. That's pretty high praise from John Grisham.
It was fun. Yes, absolutely.
I know when I got this in the mail, I thought, oh, it's a big book.
Yeah, it feels that way.
But I have to agree with the praise you have on the back, in that you start reading it and you don't go to bed. You don't go to bed when you normally do, and you keep on going.
Yeah.
How different was it for you to write nonfiction versus fiction?
You know, I started out with this recognizing that if I tried to tell a story about this subject, which is hog farms in eastern North Carolina and a giant historic litigation about them, if I told it in a boring way, I would have zero readers. I mean, there's no way for the topic to sell itself. In fact, if anything, I knew that the topic was going to be something a hurdle that I'd have to clear. And so I started out, with the compulsion to write, with the passion for the story because of the people. And as I thought about how to tell the story, I thought of Jonathan Harr's Civil Action back in the 1990s, which is, I read it in college. It was one of the reasons I went to law school. I loved that story. It was a true story, but it was written like a legal thriller. And I thought, you know what? If I could tell this story in that style, basically like a novel, like one of my novels, that, notwithstanding the subject matter, would actually be totally compelling. Because in fact, it's an untold civil rights story about a gigantic litigation. If I could get into the heart of that and make it feel like a novel, get to the granular level of detail with the characters, and have that dramatic tension, the story arc across the book, I could convince a reader to stay up late at night and have that exact experience. And what's been really beautiful is to read review after review after review and hear stories, anecdotes, get letters in the mail, emails, from readers saying exactly that. I was so surprised that I didn't want to put this down. So I'm grateful that I managed to pull that off.
You did. And I say it right away, just in case people are looking at the size of the book.
And I will mention that unfortunately, nonfiction, I wish I could cut this out, but the last bit of the book, like 100 pages, are notes and index. And I'm just like, could we get rid of those in the paperback? Because it just makes it look thicker. And, but what are you going to do? You got to have the proof. You got to have the receipts in case I get sued, right? So.
And you're a lawyer, so
yeah,
you can take care of that. Well, this conversation tonight, we could take to so many levels because of looking at industrial farming, looking at environmental impact, pollution, morality of housing animals in this way.
Sure.
But the book has a very the focus is how these folks went to trial.
Yeah.
How did they take them to trial? And really just want to ask you, how did that happen? What was the focus?
So really the community in eastern North Carolina, it's the remnants of an ancient sea. It's a coastal plain, former tobacco lands. Basically, it's the world that King Tobacco built and reigned over for 200 years. Before, in the 50s, tobacco went on a slide, and farmers were looking for a salvation. They were looking for a way to keep their family farms. And along came Wendell Murphy, the godfather of the modern hog industry, with contracts where he did with hogs what Don Tyson did with chickens, which was put them in barns and basically say, they're my animals, but you can raise them. And so Wendell Murphy supersized the industry. And everyone in eastern North Carolina considers him a hero to this very day. He's in his 80s now. He still is the godfather of the hog industry. There was one constituency that he never asked permission of even though he knew very well what was happening. And frankly, nobody ever asked their permission. And that were the neighbors of these hog factories, the neighbors who had lived on this land, many of them. And this, again, is very rural. A lot of these folks are poor. Most of them are actually people of color, the descendants, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of formerly enslaved people in eastern North Carolina. Basically, the folks who descended from those who worked the tobacco plantations. And these folks, again, they were never asked what they thought of having to live next door to these gigantic lagoons of hog feces and urine, or shit. We'll just call it what it is. They're basically 10 times the size of an Olympic swimming pool. And it's just it's a cesspool. And then to have that manure sprayed out onto the fields next door, and to drift on the wind into their homes and onto their clotheslines and, I mean, into their bedrooms in the middle of the night. This was a simple sort of the natural progression of an industry that had created, these hog factories that were minting billions for the industry. And yet hogs produce 5 times the waste of humans. So if you put 15,000 hogs in barns and you have all of that waste in a gigantic pool that you spray out, you're talking about the waste of 75,000 humans. I mean, it's an enormity. And that's one farm. And there are 2,000, more than 2,000 in eastern North Carolina. So these folks, these neighbors, they were, as you can imagine, not politically powerful, but they rallied. They gathered their energy together in grassroots organizations. They spoke to the State House. They would go and do rallies in Raleigh. And for the most part, they got ignored. I mean, there were a handful of people who cared, but the lobbyists were too powerful. The industry, owned eastern North Carolina. And it really wasn't until, and I'm skipping over there's a whole lot more we could go into, and the book does. There's a whole story about, a generation basically of being ignored. But eventually they were able to find some lawyers to bring suit. And most lawyers in the state didn't want to touch this with not just a 10-foot pole. They didn't want to be seen in the same zip code as a lawsuit against Smithfield, because you're talking about Smithfield, while a Virginia corporation, it's got its fingerprints all over North Carolina. And it's, multi-billion-dollar company. Nobody wanted to touch it until Mona Lisa Wallace came along from the small town of Salisbury, North Carolina, and said, you know what? I've taken on Goliaths and beaten them, and I'm going to take this on. That's how they ended up in court.
And Mona Lisa, just the name of this lawyer, all of these characters are bigger than life.
I know.
And inspiring for the next generation to want to become a lawyer.
Yeah. In fact, what's funny about Mona is that when I first met her, I thought she was too good to be true. I mean, I was pretty certain that the stories that I'd heard this came to me through a friend who knew her from the same, they lived in the same small town. So it just kind of landed in my lap, and John Hart told me this story, she's really cool. But I didn't know her from anyone until I went down and actually sat in the courthouse and watched the 5th trial. And I thought, as I started to get to know people, and people were like, yeah, Mona's really special, I thought, I'm going to find some fatal flaw, because we're all human. We're all, and she's just as multidimensional and, has downsides as anyone. But I figured there was some catch, something that I loved her name right out of the gate. I was like, that's a perfect literary name. Thank you very much. Don't have to make that one up. But I was convinced that there was something missing, something that, everyone they were just kind of gilding a lily, and they were just trying to, make her sound good. In reality, I mean, I spent, I don't know how many days living around her family, around her law partners, her law firm. A number of her family work in her law firm, this small law firm. And then I went down east and spent tons of time with all these plaintiffs. And then I went to the State House in Raleigh and met with legislators who've worked with her. And everyone said the same thing over and over and over again. Like, the one legislator, and I put it in the book, said that she's a national treasure. And I was like, I know there are going to be people who will read this book who think that I'm making her sound more of a hero than she really is. But I really am not. Like, she's really a remarkable human. And to this day, I feel like she's my fairy godmother. I mean, in many ways, she's just been such a grace to me to open her life in the way that she did, to trust me with. She'd never been willing to speak to the media other than just as simple, like the simplest, post-court kind of interview. In fact, usually it was a press statement. So the idea of opening her life, her family, her firm, and helping me get access to the people in the way that she did is quite remarkable. And to this day, I'm still kind of amazed she did it. I think she's amazed also that she did it, but she's really thankful because the book has been fun.
Yeah. Why did she take the case?
It's a good question. So it came to her through some other lawyers, and she has 2 daughters, and one of them is a lawyer at her firm, the older one, and the younger one went to Duke School of the Environment, and Mona, had grown up in Salisbury in this small town, came from the wrong side of the tracks, always had a passion for the underdog. And yet her younger daughter had really started to talk to her about environmental issues. And so when she heard about, and I should also mention, she had a previous case against Smithfield, and it was actually a weird one. It was, so you may know that the largest slaughterhouse of hogs in the world is in Tar Heel, North Carolina. Yeah, I forget how many it slaughters every year, something like almost 1 million hogs or something. It's owned by Smithfield, and they have, they've got obviously a lot of waste that comes out, during the processing of hogs. And the way they get rid of it is they have these tanker trucks that come and you pour the waste into these tanker trucks. And the coupling between the pouring part and the truck is managed by a human. And the human has to get up onto the top of the tanker truck and make sure that the waste is going through the hole. Well, this waste has high, like super concentrated amounts of ammonium and hydrogen sulfide and other really toxic gases. And so one of these guys had actually gotten up on top of the tanker truck and passed out from the fumes. It had so overwhelmed him, he fell off the tanker truck, as I remember correctly, and ended up dying from the exposure to the hydrogen sulfide gas. So Mona had previously had the workers' compensation case. He was a worker under the law, had to be processed as a workers' comp case, and then they were able to sue. So she knew a little bit about hog waste, but knew nothing about how like Eastern North Carolina was and where the bacon was getting made or any of that stuff. She knew about Tar Heel. And that was the part that came to her through these other lawyers. But the real question was, okay, so she went down east like I did, like activists have done, and met with these folks, went into the communities, heard the stories, and thought, this is a compelling story. And yet at the same time, I have no idea how to quantify it. And as a plaintiff's lawyer, these are people who are not going to pay the bills. Like, these are people who are poor. They can't even pay expenses. So if I'm going to take a case against a multi-billion-dollar behemoth that could take 5, even 10 years to litigate, it's going to be on my dime. It's going to be millions of dollars. This is not a bank. Like, they're not a bank. Mona's been successful, but the idea of putting millions of dollars of your own money on the line for a case you can't value was insane. And she had these conversations with her daughter, her husband, the other lawyers at the firm, like, is this a case that we're going to take? Because we could win the moral case. We could convince a jury or many juries that these people have been harmed, that these people have suffered, that there's a moral wrong here that should be righted. But then when it comes to asking them for dollars and cents, like, how do you quantify the harm that these people have suffered from having hog shit sprayed in the air next to their homes and having it drift on the wind, and occasionally wake them up at night and make them run outside, except that it's coming from outside and they can't, deal with that, or have a kid's birthday party that gets canceled and all the kids run away, or have, how do you quantify having a child, a girl grow up? And I tell this story in the book, Lindora Farland, who grew up literally next door to this spray field. And she would get on the bus in the morning and all the kids would move to the other side of the bus. because she just stunk. So how do you quantify that? Like what kind of damage are you going to ask for from this giant corporation? And ultimately what they had to decide, I mean, there was a lot of pushback, but Mona made a decision, and I've just simply come to admire her for thinking this way. She really actually doesn't look at the dollars and cents in the final analysis. She's like, if we are right about this, and if we can put on a compelling case, we'll worry about the money later. And that's how she's rolled from the day when she was, had multiple mortgages and barely keeping the lights on, to, having taken down some of the biggest corporations in the country. So she made that decision all on her own. And she was just like, we're going to do it. We're going to do it. We're going to go all in. She did not know, I will say, she's told me this many times, she did not know how hard it was going to be. And she's often thought through the process that she's not sure she would do it again in exactly that way. She'll probably never get another case like it.
You mentioned the Farland
Yes.
Family, and I think that I was struck with how difficult it was for them to convey odor.
Yes.
How do you share? But that scene where Daniel Wallace walks onto that was, I noted it. I mean, can you share with us just kind of what everyone experienced, including yourself, in terms of how do you communicate something that's that foul?
Yeah. It's like that old saw from the Supreme Court. You know it when you see it. I mean, with this, it's just, it when you smell it. And the problem is that I can sit here telling you about it all day, but until you experience it, it's just not the same. And the young lawyers, she mentioned Daniel Wallace. So that's Mona's nephew, Mona's husband's brother's son. And Daniel works at the firm. He was he started at the firm right as they were getting into this case. And it became the only thing he did for 7 years. At the beginning, he was really skeptical. I mean, he was like, look, are these just disgruntled people? I mean, look, this company makes the world's bacon. I've eaten it. Lots of people eat it, makes the world's pork. So isn't that a good thing? I mean, this is a farming community, pigs stink. They've been around for, eons. Is this really a case? I mean, his question was are these people just disgruntled neighbors, kind of overblowing it? Are they just looking for a payday, like everybody on the industry side is saying? And it wasn't until he went down east for the first time and really had this insanely visceral experience, so there were 26 communities. There were many other communities of the 2,000 plus hog farms that they could have chosen. They chose 26 communities to bring individual complaints. And then the court chose 5 communities to actually have trials. And the purpose was to get, bellwether verdicts to determine how much the cases are worth so that you can settle the cases. Because you're not going to try all 26 communities, which would have been divided up into hundreds of trials. Nobody can, not even Smithfield is going to do that. Nobody can afford that. So you got to get bellwether verdicts. So they had these 5 communities, and the way that Mona's team divided them up is that each lawyer was supposed to handle a particular community together with some paralegal help. So Daniel got the Farlands community. So the hog farmer in that community was the police captain or the police chief of Beulahville, small town. He was a volunteer firefighter. His father was a real estate investor. You can imagine this guy had a lot of clout in the community. He was the sort of person that nobody would complain about. You just wouldn't. And so Daniel drove down there one day, and he was tasked with meeting the community. And he pulled up at the Farlands house and realized, wait a minute. And he just looked, sit in the driveway, and I've been there, spent time on her porch. Sit in the driveway, and you look to your left, and what you see, you could almost hit it with a rock, is the giant barns. I mean, there's no screen, there's no windbreak, there's nothing. It was just a giant field where they sprayed the hog shit, and the giant barns out in the distance, and the cesspool, which is, you could almost see it, although it's, ground level. He pulls in, and he's still thinking, wow, that's close, but at the same time, whatever. And he opens the door, and he told me this story, and he was like, Corbin, it was a day that I'll never forget in my life. He's like, how could you? I opened the door, and the smell of the air was so foul that it was like hitting a wall. He was like, it was in my nose and my throat. I mean, this is exactly the same experience that all the plaintiffs described. He was like, Joey wasn't even spraying that day. So it was just in the air. And he's like thinking to himself, I got to get back in the car and hightail it out of here. Like, I don't want to be here. Why am I here? Like, this is a terrible case. Like, I don't want to do this. But he saw the Farland family sitting on the porch in this air, waiting to talk to him. He had to get out. He had to have the conversation. And he described that experience. And he said, Corbin, so many people are skeptical of this until they experience it. And I had to do the same thing. I mean, I was like, I can't write this book unless I didn't have an experience quite as awful as that. But I went and tracked down, with the help of an activist, farms that were spraying, and I don't want to get out of the car. Like, you roll down the window, I'm like, can we just keep driving? It's just really, really foul. And they've even made improvements since the day that Daniel was on the farm. So yes, those experiences were pivotal in shaping the way the lawyers felt about the case. They knew, like, he walked away from that experience saying, there's a problem here. These people should not have to live this way, and we've got to do something about it. And
why was the legal system the best way for these people to be heard?
So there's this moment, by way of anecdote, I'll answer that with a story. So there's a guy in Eastern North Carolina who's like, you can't even make this up. His name is Jimmy Dixon. And if you read the book, you'll understand who Jimmy Dixon is. But he's exactly what you would expect of just like, straight out of central casting, the kind of, rural politician who's basically his whole life, like, he was a former hog farmer, turkey farmer. His whole life is about protecting the industry. So there was a point where he sponsored a bill. The case was already 3 years in and was on the cusp of motions for summary judgment. So right before trial, he sponsors a bill to change the 400-year-old definition of nuisance to basically say farm, in industrial farming operations are exempt from not having to basically pollute your neighbor. And he not only wanted to change the definition of nuisance and basically say, if you're a farming operation, you can be a nuisance all you want, but he wanted to apply it retroactively so that the courthouse would be closed to these cases. Like, he was trying to actually assassinate the case, to take it out. So in responding to this, Mona's firm and Mona's partners, it's interesting. They play the political game really well, because Mona's a very sort of, Democrat, and Bill Graham, her partner's a Republican, ran for governor at one point, and they know how to operate on both sides of the aisle. So they went to the State House, and Bill Graham really was pushing the Republican side. So he actually had a sit-down meeting with Jimmy Dixon. And Jimmy's like, you guys are just, your clients, they just want money. They're just out for money. And like, why are you doing this? And Bill Graham responded and said, Jimmy, as a citizen, when you look for help at the local level and they tell you, sorry, you're out of luck, and you look for help at the state level from the government, from the governor, from the attorney general, and they tell you you're out of luck, and you go to the state house and people like you say you shouldn't have your day in court, where else are people supposed to go other than to the courthouse? Like, the only way to get justice, unfortunately, in 20th century, 21st century America, in many contexts, because of political capture, is in the courthouse. And I'm sorry to say that, but it's true. In so many industries, they have bought and paid for the legislature at the state level and often the federal level. It's not, the Supreme Court says it's not corrupt. It's the way that American politics works, but Sure looks corrupt to me, but it's totally legal. And that's the way it goes. So if you're a citizen and you've got an industry polluting and being a bad neighbor, and you try to, you try to complain, people get shut down. So what do? You have to go to the courthouse. That was ultimately what everyone realized after 20 years of fighting this in every other way and getting nowhere. It was like, all right, we got only one other option, and that's to find a lawyer.
And that was the same. Was Jimmy Dixon the one who put his grandson on the shoulders to walk through the pig farm?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, exactly. Well, he told the story. I mean, I didn't see him do that. I don't know. But yeah, it's such a, you can't make these characters up. Like as I was writing the story, I mean, there were so many times I just thought, what a gift, like left and right. Like I'm a novelist. So I spent most of my life making, characters up, which meant I did tons of research. I traveled all over the world. I did tons of interviews. I got to know the subjects. I found people who I wanted to use in a composite way in my stories. But in the end, I would put pieces of different characters together, and here they had to be whole characters. Yeah. And so the fact that left and right, I found I love these characters, and so wow, it's fun to write about them. Or I really loathe these characters, so boy, it's fun to write about them too. It was just like it was pretty wild. Yeah.
Well, we have barely scratched the surface of this cesspool. But I do want to open it up. We're about midway through and open it up for questions.
Yeah. So the question was, is Mona from North Carolina? Yes, she's was born there and lived there her whole life. Salisbury is actually in the Piedmont near Charlotte. So it's west. So Eastern North Carolina. And really, when I talk about the farmland, the hog country, which I call it in the book, it's like, if you take the I-95 corridor between I-95 and the coast, there's this middle part. That's what I call hog country, where the largest density of these hog factories are. So Mona lives in Salisbury, which is close to Charlotte. It's west of Raleigh. So it's about a 3.5 hour drive from down east. Feels like you're driving into another world. She didn't. And in fact, that's one of the things that was so remarkable about this, is that this was a hidden problem. I mean, even though, actually the Raleigh News and Observer won a Pulitzer Prize for a series on Wendell Murphy's influence in being the godfather of hogs back in the 90s. And of course, Mona had lived there and been practicing law. This wasn't on her radar. Like, it had gotten some press, but it really wasn't on her radar at all, really, until she had that first Smithfield case, and then heard about, the way the bacon's made. Yeah.
The question is on spraying the waste and whether they're doing that to fertilize the ground.
Yeah, great question. And I wish that I had visuals here, because my usual presentation is, oh gosh, they're actually fascinating. My usual presentation has lots of visuals and audio and stuff, and you can't unsee it. I mean, once you see it, you can't unsee it. So the idea that when Wendell Murphy invented and he literally invented industrial hog production, he had to figure out, okay, with all these hogs in barns, what do I do with all this waste? So the first thought was, well, we'll just dig a big hole in the ground and shovel all that stuff into it. And, it'll be a cesspool. Great. We'll use anaerobic digestion, which is just fancy for, a bunch of waste sitting around doing what it does. And then, but the problem is, of course, if you're constantly cycling hogs through the barns, there's this endless amount of waste. It's a river. You've got to deal with the fact that these cesspools only have a finite volume. So once the waste reaches the berm, it's against the permit. I mean, the law and the regulations are really loose. But one thing you can't do is have spillage, because that'll definitely pollute everything. So they figured out, okay, well, so if we take the cesspools, we've got to have a dynamic solution where we can evacuate this stuff. It would be really expensive to haul it off, and where would we put it? How about we use all this sort of unused farmland that's lying around? It's kind of fallow ground. And oh, by the way, waste is a fertilizer, even though this is unbelievably, intense and sort of overwhelming. Well, we might grow some stuff. So the thought was, maybe we'll have some row crops out here. And if you actually look at most of the spray field is pretty much plowed dirt. I mean, they grow wildflowers. And so in the early days, they basically created these giant, I call them Jurassic-sized sprinklers, these big spray guns. Just take like a bird and a pterodactyl. Well, that's like the relationship, so this spray gun's yay high, and it basically is this cannon. I mean, it really looks like a cannon, and it shoots, the shit up 50 to 100 feet in the air. And it just kind of goes around, and it just shoots it out, and it just falls down onto the earth and drifts on the wind. It's funny because you think someone must have looked at that and thought that's going to be a problem for the people who live next door. But the challenge is that the people next door were largely invisible, and they had been invisible for a couple hundred years. These are people that just were not politically powerful, and they were not part of the conversation in Eastern North Carolina, except really within the Black community. And, even though segregation ended a long time ago, it's in many ways still a very de facto segregated community. You got, Black people living in these communities, and most white people stay away. You've got most of the hog farmers are white. And, most of the churches the hog farmers go to are all white, and the Black churches are their own thing in the neighborhoods. And a lot of the churches that were affected by the spray. I mean, the stories of funerals that were interrupted. I mean, of course, you imagine a Black church having a big outdoor funeral, and a potluck afterward. I mean, in the traditional way, imagine, all of a sudden the hog farmer next door spraying, and everybody just races off because you can't, how could you possibly eat? I mean, it's just like the most foul stench in the world.
And speaking of that, you bring China in the beginning. I just want to mention that $7 billion purchase. Yeah. And you said one of the finer points was that it cost half as much to raise a hog in North Carolina than it would be in China. So there's other systems of dealing with this. Oh yeah,
there are. And in fact, the reason that, in the 5-year plan that the Communist Party put together for China back in 2012, if I remember correctly, they have one, of course, every 5 years. There was a big push by the CCP to encourage Chinese investors to buy up agricultural interests and agricultural land. So they went on a buying spree. They bought a bunch of land, and then they bought Smithfield. And they came in 2013 with, and I say they, it was a company called Shuangwei at the time, now WH Group. It was basically the Smithfield of China. And there had been talks of a merger for a long time, but eventually what happened is the Chinese company came in and said, we'll pay $7 billion for Smithfield. That was 30% above the market capitalization or the value of the company. And it was funded in part by a $4 billion loan from the Bank of China, which was approved in a single day. Now you wonder what kind of strings get pulled to approve a $4 billion loan in a single day. So there was a hearing in the Senate in the Agricultural Committee, and Larry Pope, who had taken over at Smithfield, got trotted in there to answer questions, as the corporate types sometimes do. And, he got asked this question tongue in cheek by one of the senators. Hey, did you know that the communist Chinese are trying to take over your company? And of course, he just chuckles. He's like, ha, 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 ha. Oh, what are you talking? I haven't seen any communist. I mean, it was almost that bad. It was like, really? You can't make this stuff up. So of course, the way that the Communist Party of China works is a lot subtler, and yet its influence is everywhere. And there was a reporter that actually got an interview, and I just can't imagine how he got this, but with the company, Shuangwei's president, Wan Long, with his son in Hong Kong. Company's headquartered in Hong Kong. So Wan Long's son stands above Victoria Harbor in Hong Kong and basically admits that the Communist Party of China is the ghost in the machine, is the wizard behind the curtain. And you're like, how could he admit that? And yet he did. So it came out that, hey, yeah, they were actually right. Larry Pope, I don't know why he was saying, well, I know why he was saying what he was saying. But nevertheless, like that was a very intentional move on the part of the Chinese government to acquire major agricultural interests, largely for the technology, but also for the methodology of raising hogs in North Carolina in particular, because ironically, you can't have lagoons and spray fields in China. Like, it's actually environmentally prohibited. So there was a great Rolling Stone article that came out, some years ago saying, is China treating North Carolina like the developing world? You can answer that question yourself. Today, they now have, and I saw this recently, there was an article that the New York Times ran. I think there was another one as well I saw. Now in China, hog farms are actually in skyscrapers. And they're not like, the Chrysler building, but basically they're these 16-story buildings that look like a clothing factory. I've written about them. It looks like a clothing factory where you've got hogs in this open, and it's remarkable. Like the pictures, we don't know exactly what it looks like inside when they're not being photographed. Again, the media is not free in China, so you don't know. But nevertheless, it's like all of the technology is being applied to manage the waste. They're not using lagoons and spray fields, so they're clearly dealing with the fact that they've got thousands of hogs defecating and urinating every single minute inside this giant facility. And their people are dressed in hazmat suits and they've got ping pong tables for, it almost looks like, a cross between like Facebook and, a giant hog factory in China. But you kind of can't believe it, right? Like they've actually innovated in order to raise these animals, been raised since ancient times in a highly, technological environment. And they've come up with ways of dealing with the waste that don't involve polluting the neighbors and driving them off their land and making life like a living hell. So yeah, if China can do it, we could do it. But see, the challenge is and this is what I came back to over and over and over again in the book, it all comes down to money. And if the government's not forcing corporations to actually internalize the cost of their business model to humans and the environment, if they're allowing these corporations to get away with polluting their neighborhoods, well, then the cost is going to be borne by society, and the only redress is in the courts. But if the government stepped up, and there's a great law, we could talk about this. Cory Booker would love to pass a law that would change all of this, but unfortunately, right now, I don't see it going too far in Congress.
Just talking about that regulatory, I think it was interesting. And I think the final trial that they brought the Department of Environment Quality regulator, chief regulator, to testify on the part of Smithfield for adherence to the regulations. And just share with us how that sort of backfired. Oh, man. It actually then gives you a real gasp in terms of thinking about the efficiency of our regulatory systems.
Seriously. So yeah, one of the when I got to know Mike Keskey, the trial lawyer that Mona brought on board, one of the best in the country, he told me, so there are a number of cross-examinations that I will never forget. And one of my favorites was Christine Lawson, who was the head of the regulator, the Department of Environmental Quality in North Carolina. So one of Smithfield's defenses was, hey, look, we are compliant with the law and the regulations. So we can't be a nuisance now, of course, the definition of nuisance is being an unreasonable interference to your neighbor. That regulations may very well not be sufficient. You can very well be a nuisance. But still, Smithfield brings in Christine Lawson, the head of DEQ, to testify. The chief regulator gets her on the stand, and she spends, the direct testimony comes from Smithfield's lawyer. And so she's clearly a proud woman. She's proud of her job and of the work that they do, and they do some good work with the laws they're given. But Mike asked her some questions like, isn't it true that your budget's basically been slashed by more than half, in the last few years? Yes. Isn't it true that, the legislators in Raleigh have basically reorganized their department, so now it's being run by a politician, the agricultural commissioner, who's pro-industry, basically lives in the industry in one of these barns. That's that kind of guy. And then she's like, yes. And so Mike said, well, So I want to ask you about a specific scenario. Like there's a story that I've been told, and I'm just wondering about it. Isn't it true that you actually had an experience of witnessing a farm directly spraying waste into the nearby creek bed? And she said yes. And he said, all right. So you were there, you witnessed this. What did you do about it? And I just can't imagine this. She said, well, I placed a call to Smithfield, to the vice president of environment at Smithfield, and I asked him for permission to stop the spraying. And Mike, and you're sitting there, and of course the 12 jurors are watching this. They had the same reaction I'm sure you did, which is, what? You're the regulator. You mean you don't have the power to see a violation and stop it? I mean, imagine telling me, you're a police officer, you're watching somebody's pocket get picked, and you've got to go ask somebody else for permission to go after the pickpocket. I mean, wait, what? And she had to admit it. And he actually took her further down this road. And basically she had to admit all of the ways in which the industry could and does game the system. The inspections, she's got 3 inspectors for 2,100 hog factories. And, you imagine how thorough those inspections are. And they happen maybe once a year. And so it's really easy to game that, right? And in fact, oh wow, she's aware of the fact that it even came up in one of the trials that a lot of these, each one of these farms has what's called a waste management or waste utilization plan, which is a euphemism for how do you spray the shit and when. And, you're supposed to basically keep a log and not spray on days when it rained or when there's water on the ground. And you're supposed to, not spray over a certain amount per month or per week or whatever. And there was even a case of the 5 that they tried where the guy was caught keeping double books. And I mean, that case turned out the biggest verdict in North Carolina history. He had some other problems, that hog farmer.
He was not your family farmer,
no,
which was
he was
the
not.
other side.
But man, did he make it was so much fun to write about him. So if you read the book, the third trial, I kind of used it as a narrative climax because it turned out, the gigantic verdict. And it was just it's when the world was on fire. It was when Smithfield realized after all these years of playing every game known under the sun, to keep the regulators at bay, to keep the media at bay, to keep the neighbors at bay. I don't know for sure because they wouldn't talk to me, but I'm pretty sure that verdict left them with the distinct impression that they were going to have to get the heck out of Dodge and find a way to settle the case. And eventually they did. We don't know for how much, but I know Mona and Mike pretty well. And I know that they weren't going to let them out the door without paying a pretty penny. So that was the ultimate it's funny, a lot of people who aren't lawyers, look at plaintiffs' lawyers and, call them trial lawyers, and industry's done a really good job of tarring and feathering trial lawyers. And there's some really unfortunate trial lawyers who've helped with that bad impression. But, good trial lawyers really stand between injustice and these gigantic corporations. And they are capable of and willing to take them on. And they, are the ones who ultimately can produce in this kind of political environment real change, which is, I'm grateful for.
Right here. How do we break? He was saying that Smithfield is a monopoly.
Yeah,
how do we break the monopolies?
Antitrust is part of U.S. law that is rarely used. And, it's unfortunate, I think, because it was created for good reason. And yet, a lot of gigantic corporations have found a way around it by basically convincing the regulators that as long as they are reducing the consumer price of goods, that they can be as big as they want. As long as they're not, basically allying with one another, in order to keep prices high, which was the initial impetus for antitrust law, then, they shouldn't be busted. But I would agree with you that there are a lot of industries in which you have way too much power concentrated in a handful of people. And that's true with industrial meat. I mean, that's true in a lot of industries. You're right. And I would love to see, revival of antitrust law. I'd also love to see, look, if you follow the money, you realize pretty quickly in a lot of different industries what's going on. Industry will, because the way that and I'm not an anti-capitalist. I think that business, my grandfather went to Harvard Business School and told me that businesses, when run by decent people, can actually they can bring jobs, they can benefit a community. I believe that. The challenge is that, especially with Wall Street in control of so many of these public companies, their short-term incentive is to constantly maximize profit. And of course, that means reduce all expenses and externalize expenses as much as possible. That just means, look, if we can force society to pay for it, we will. They're incentivized to do this, and their executives and their shareholders and their board members and everybody all the way down the food chain is incentivized to do this. And it really takes politicians and it takes community power to say, no, actually what you need to do, industry, is be honest about your costs. And if you're creating cost for society, you should bear that cost. And in fact, you shouldn't just bear it in the courthouse. You should bear it on your bottom line, so that everybody in the entire industry, in these corporations knows, you can't just pollute the environment and screw your neighbors and the community and say, well, society will clean it up. Those costs should be borne on the bottom line. And that takes good laws and that takes good enforcement. And, but it also, unfortunately, on the other side, as I talked about, really powerful corporations and industries have really powerful lobbyists, and they're very, very effective. And not every lobbyist is bad. I've gotten to know, lobbyists through the years, and they see themselves as bringing information to legislators who have too many bills to pass and don't know what's in most of them. And so, hey, I can provide some information about my industry, and that's a good thing. So really what it comes back to, and as far as I'm concerned, is not really the lobbyists as much as campaign finance. Now that's a rabbit hole that we are not going to go down here. But nevertheless, again, follow the money. I constantly beat that dead horse. Just follow the money in one way or another. And you very often, maybe not always, but very often get pretty close to an answer about why things are so screwed up.
You did talk to Chris a little bit about the reaction of folks to this book, mostly on the plaintiff side and on the people, the neighbors.
Yeah.
But I wondered if you'd heard from these other characters that you portray, the Jimmy Dixons and the legislators and the executives of Smithfield. Did you have response on this book?
No, I didn't. And I wasn't expecting it because, look, they've litigated they've told their story in the press through press releases and through the litigation. And you had 5 federal trials and they had lots of coverage. And look, they've been telling their story forever and ever. And the press release at the end, after the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the verdicts and after they settled the case, was the very same song and dance they've been trotting out every time, they're given an opportunity, which is the media doesn't understand us. We make good food responsibly, period. That's that. So no, they weren't going to give me the time of day. I did get through to one of their lawyers who lives in Charlottesville, really good guy, poor guy, because he was the lawyer in the third case where he just got spanked. I mean, it was just bad. And I just felt bad for him because you just get assigned this by your gigantic 1,000 lawyer law firm. And I mean, you're going to take the case, you're going to do it. You're going to do your best. And he just had bad facts. He had a hard client, whatever, but I reached out to him and I was like, hey, would you mind, I'd love to get at minimum just a comment or two, but I would love to actually talk to you about the experience if you'd be willing. He's the only person I heard back from. And he wrote me right away. And he's a fellow UVA law grad and basically was like, look, Corbin, thanks for reaching out. I'd be happy to talk to you, but I've got to get clearance and I don't expect to. So if you don't hear back, you'll understand. And I didn't hear back. So that was that. Now, if we are successful in getting this adapted for the screen, and that's what I'm really, really hoping, we've got a producer in Hollywood who's working on that. If this turns into, your next Apple limited series, at that point, then I think they will say something. Maybe not to me, because I've got the receipts. Like, I know that what I wrote is accurate, but they probably will have to say something at that point. At this point, it's just a book. I'm just me, and while Grisham gave me a great forward, if Grisham had written this book, they would have said something, because by now millions of people would have read it. But I don't have that big of an audience. But now I have a bigger one, thanks to you.
That's right. Right here, yeah. What's the condition on the ground right now, and has anything gotten better? Yeah,
I love that question, and Mona does too. I mean, her heart from the beginning was, how do we make this better for the people? And the challenge is that there are limits to the law. And as a lawyer, I understood from the beginning. They had to make choices about how they would try the case and what kind of relief that they would be able to ask for from the court. And for reasons that make a lot of sense, and I mentioned in the book, they didn't ask for an injunction, which would be a court order to force changes to the farm, because it would really only apply to certain farms. And in reality, it would be a massive expense that really should be either politically enforced or just force Smithfield to pay it to the clients, and then they'll get their act together. So in the end, what they asked for were damages and punitive damages. But the hope was that if they got walloped big enough, that the industry would actually, start to improve, and they did. So after the gigantic verdict, almost $500 million for one community of 8 people, and it was almost all punitive damages. After that, the industry said, "All right, well, we're going to have more trials, and we've got to do something." And I'm speculating here. I don't know for sure what their thinking was, but at the same time, you kind of can read the tea leaves, because what happened is they started taking, so part of the nuisance was these trucks. So if you've got 10,000 hogs on a farm, you've got trucks coming to and from that farm constantly, because either they're bringing hogs or taking them away, or picking up the dead hogs, which they leave rotting or they used to leave rotting in open air dumpsters. They often sat right next door to the plaintiff's property, attracted flies and buzzards, and stunk to high heaven. So you've got trucks coming in with feed, and you've got trucks coming in, for other reasons. And so, there were communities where these trucks literally would drive just feet away from people's bedroom windows at all hours of day and night. And so Mona put out, and her team, she got a National Geographic videographer to stalk the trucks. And so he went undercover, and put out deer cams, and was staking out in the middle of the night in order to capture these trucks coming at all hours. So the juries got to see the trucks. Well, and one thing that Mike just kept emphasizing over and over again in his cross exams were, do you have to run the trucks at night? I mean, really, couldn't you just do it a little bit more efficiently during the daytime? And so sure enough, after the giant verdict, they stopped the nighttime truck runs, only run the trucks during daytime hours. After the jury saw enough of the rotting, bloated corpses of giant hogs being left to get picked at by the carrion birds, the company decided, well, maybe we could manage this a little bit differently. And so they started putting refrigerated dead boxes on the properties. Those were, and that definitely helped. There was the innovation, which had already been present on some farms. But how about we take the giant cannon that shoots the shit way up in the sky? Why don't we take that and decommission it? Because maybe that's a little bit too medieval. And maybe we could just attach something to the back of one of our tractors and kind of just drizzle it into the dirt. So they call that the airway system. So they did that. And in effect, they started putting the airway systems out on some of the farms. But the challenge was that they didn't actually do this to all their farms. And there were a lot of farms that were not subject to any of the lawsuits. And so, I've spoken to people who were part of the lawsuit who didn't get their cases tried. And their response when I asked, is it better? They said, it's a little bit better, because now the hog farmers know they they think they could get sued, even though the law got changed by Jimmy Dixon to basically eliminate nuisance for agricultural interests. But they think they could get sued, and so they've started to spray in different places at different times of day. And overall, it is better. It's not as bad as it used to be. I'm grateful for that. But here's the truth. So in the middle of the trials, Mike Keskey got a number of the corporate execs on the stand and started asking them questions about money, which got really, really uncomfortable for them. How much money do you make, sir? And how much money does the CEO of Smithfield make? And how much money did Wan Long, the head of Shuangwei, pay himself in a bonus after he acquired Smithfield in 2013? Oh, that was about $500 million. It's like, okay, so actually it was Wan Long and his another board member on Shuangwei got paid a $500 million bonus for acquiring Smithfield. So it's like, oh, wow. And how much money does the corporation bring back in profit every year? Well, WH Group, Shuangwei, about $1 billion a year. And it's like, okay, so how much would it cost to just cover your lagoons? Because we could eliminate some of the problem with covering your lagoons. You guys had to do that in Missouri because the Missouri AG stepped in, unlike North Carolina, and actually required some stuff. So how much would that cost? And, and they ran through the numbers. And basically what it came down to is that it would cost Smithfield a pretty penny, a few $100 million over the course probably of 10 years to institute like real changes to, and the technology exists because guess what? Smithfield paid for it. So there was I'm answering a question all over the place, but Smithfield paid for it. So Smithfield actually spent $25 million. It was 15 originally. Forced the Attorney General, instead of doing what Missouri did and actually enforcing some law, the Attorney General of North Carolina in 2000 said after Hurricane Floyd flooded every river in eastern North Carolina with hog shit and killed 1 billion fish, it was like, oh, okay, so we're going to do something. So they forced Smithfield to pay a few $1 million to develop new technology. And they gave North Carolina State ag engineers the job of replace the lagoon and spray field system with something new. So they came up with, over 10 years, they came up with something called super soils, which later became Terra Blue in the third iteration. And there was a lot of hope. But Smithfield was really good, and the industry was really good at figuring out how to torpedo this. And so, of course, if you've got something that's run by politicians and a university, there are going to be a lot of committees involved. And so there was a committee that ran the economic question, whether it would be economically feasible to require Smithfield to put this on all of its farms. And of course, that was left undefined in the agreement because lawyers hate to define those terms in advance. Smithfield never would have let it, I don't think. No good lawyer would have let that happen. So they left it intentionally vague so that people could argue about it later on. Well, then they stacked the economic subcommittee with people from industry so that they had a majority. And basically what they said was, yeah, we've got new technology. It will cost more than our medieval lagoons and spray fields. And guess what? That means it's not economically feasible. So Smithfield was able to, and the industry was able to torpedo over a decade of development of new technology. They've got the tech. It's there. They know what it just would cost more money, and they just refuse to pay it. And at the end of the day, that's the bottom line. And until, sadly, the lawsuits, in answer to your question, the lawsuits did not force them to do that. And that is what Cory Booker's bill would help get, push in that direction. But again, we've got, challenges in Congress. So
when the movie comes out,
Maybe
we can see it.
Wouldn't that be
we
amazing?
Need to all see it this way. Well, we have run over time.
Okay, sorry.
But it's okay. And I highly recommend that you all pick up a copy of the book. We have the books over here with Stone Soup. Corbin is going to be here to sign books for folks. I want to thank Pale Fire again for hosting us, and the Gaines Group, and also you all for coming out and bringing your questions. So thank you again. Let's give Corbin.
Thank you.
And am I still on? I just wonder too, has it reconsidered your bacon? I mean, do you look at it in a new way?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I'll never eat Smithfield bacon again that I'm aware of. The challenge is they're so big that they're in everything. So like universities get all their bacon from Smithfield. And maybe not every university, but apparently one of the major sources for pork to most universities in America uses Smithfield. They're hidden in that way. So you wouldn't necessarily know. I'll never knowingly eat Smithfield pork again. And so, you know, what I tell people is, and all the people in the community, they all eat bacon. They've always had, you know, their breakfast bacon. It's just like, we've got it. We'll eat less. It'll cost more to buy local. I mean, that's the thing. We'll just buy from people who raise it just like God intended on the ground. There you go. And we don't have to, you know, eat industrial stuff anymore. There you go. Thank you.